When President Trump says we're done, Israel is going to be done. And Israelis could be disappointed at this outcome because an agreement is not something that Israel favors.
Shira Efron on how Israelis see the war with Iran and what's at stake politically. Is the fact that there's an election coming in Israel part of the Prime Minister's calculation in starting this war?
There is a sense in Israel that this perpetual state of war also serves the Prime Minister's political objectives. This is a good reason to keep postponing elections, especially if all polling shows that you're not likely to win.
From Bloomberg Weekend, this is the Mishal Husain Show. Once again, the headlines have been moving fast on the Middle East. So fast, in fact, that there have been times when it's nearly impossible to work out where the truth actually lies. One moment there's a US threat to bomb power plants. The next, a pivot towards a deal with Iran.
But again, I'm not guaranteeing anything. They want to make a deal very badly.
Which made us think, where does all of that unpredictability on US intentions leave Israel? Polling suggests that around 80% of Israelis support the war with Iran. And that's part of what we explore in this next conversation. It's with Shira Efron, who's been a Middle East analyst for the last 20 years and is now Distinguished Chair of Israel Policy at RAND, a think tank which gets most of its funding from the US government and the US military. I had heard her say on another podcast that she's more about policy than politics. But in this, we did talk about political leadership, about the elections that are due in Israel later this year, about the Mossad and Iran, the situation in Lebanon, Gaza, and on the West Bank. We began, though, with Shira herself, because I wanted to know about the impact of these weeks of war on her life in Tel Aviv.
It's lost on outside audiences who see Israel and the US as the aggressors here, right, and look at the damage that Iran is inflicting on everyone else, to forget there is a human dimension also in Israel, regardless of the role in this war. I will say on the personal level, we are fine, God bless. We have a bomb shelter at home that when we moved into this house, we never thought we would use. But past October 7, it's been the room most frequented in the house by all of us. So it's back to routine, quite heavy hitting. We live in the central part of Israel, in Tel Aviv. So Tel Aviv is hit pretty frequently down to the sirens. I have 3 boys who are, unlike their parents, quite happy to be at home, but it's something that they've gotten used to, right? After COVID, which the whole world experienced. And then post October 7, I think these kids barely had school in the past 6 years.
But even at home, it means that there are times you hear the sirens day or night and you're all down in the bomb shelter.
Yes. It's a pretty functioning system, but there's a ear-shattering scream that comes through the phones before the sirens come to make sure you wake up. And then about between 6 to 10 minutes afterwards, the sirens come. We all go down to the shelter. You waited 10 minutes. You hear those bombs exploding somewhere, whether it's a direct hit. And it's quite ironic, but you even hear the kids say, oh, it sounds like a cluster rocket now, or it sounds like a direct hit, or maybe it's the Iron Dome interception. Then we get out. We try to sort of continue with our lives, but we're mostly stranded to home. We are fine, gotten used to this, but it is challenging. And there are other Israelis who are less lucky, right? There have been casualties, obviously, property damages across the country.
Yeah. Help me understand whether Israeli public opinion on this war has shifted as the weeks have gone on. The most recent polling I've seen has suggested about 80% support for this war. Do you sense any change in the public mood?
So I think there are 2 things that can be true at once. Support for the war remains at around 80%. These are the last polls that I've seen as well from a variety of sources. There is a belief in the necessity of this war to remove an existential threat from Israel. And we can debate the merit of this argument. However, there is a fatigue, right? People are home. with the kids. It's very difficult for working parents to go to work. I think anyone who survived COVID with kids would sympathize with this issue. It takes a toll on the independence, people who own their own businesses. Obviously, anyone who is in reserve duty. Israel has been at war for around 900 days. I have friends who've been in reserve duty for 800 of these days. And there is maybe a slight decline in the numbers, in the belief that this war will reach its objectives, which from an Israeli perspective was supposed to bring a toppling of the Iranian regime. And I think this is where we see this slight shift in sort of understanding, yes, this war is necessary, and it is weakening the regime, and it's degrading capabilities that Iran has to strike Israel. But there's a slight decline in the belief that it will remove the threat once and for all.
Yeah. But is that also linked to the fact that last summer, Israelis were told by Benjamin Netanyahu at the end of the 12-day war that the sword of the Iranian threat hanging over their heads had been removed? Is there any level of confusion at being told that last summer and going to war again this year?
Oh, absolutely. And I think there's a feeling of deja vu. We had heard only in June 2025 that the Iranian threat was removed. Obviously, the US president also said that he obliterated the Iranian nuclear plan. So how come only 8 months after, and the Israeli public, unlike publics around the world, have been ready for round two for a couple of months before this round broke? Very clearly, the question is like, wait, if we just did it, how come we need to do it again? And it's not just Iran. There's a secondary front that could turn into a primary front. But when we look at South Lebanon, we had heard that Hezbollah was decimated, right? Hezbollah is a Shiite group in Lebanon. It's also a terrorist group. That Hezbollah was decimated and that we took out its arsenal. So in a sense, there is misalignment with the promises and the declarations that are coming from Israeli leadership versus reality. And this is, I think, one of the gaps that is frustrating the Israeli public.
And that makes me want to ask you, Shira, is the fact that there's an election coming in Israel part of the Prime Minister's calculation in starting this war?
One of the, I think, the most frustrating thing in Israel at the moment, that it's very difficult to disconnect anything that is happening in this country from political motivations. For Prime Minister Netanyahu, I want to say Iran has been like a religion. For 4 decades, he's been speaking about the need to remove to hit the Islamic Republic of Iran. Yeah, he's using apocalyptic terms, and he's been using them for 3 to 4 decades, including presentations with props of the UN that some people may remember. So it is genuine from his perspective. It does not mean that what he sees as the national interest does not align well with his political interests. And of course, the reason for opening this war, the first round in June, and then now again, this was an operational opportunity that we can get into. But there is a sense in Israel that the desire to keep Israelis off their feet and in this perpetual state of war also serves the prime minister's political objectives. Because first of all, it's very difficult to go to elections when you're in the middle of a war, right? This is a good reason to keep postponing elections, especially if all polling shows that you're not likely to win again.
Just to dig into that, you think that could be part of the calculation, a desire to delay the election, so there might not be one this year?
It's difficult to say. There's an indication now that the elections will take place in time, but I do want to remind you that when October 7 happened, the biggest failure, the biggest massacre of Jews since the Holocaust, right? The expectation in Israel was that the prime minister will resign and the country will go to elections to receive a renewed mandate from the Israeli public. That has not happened. And the pretext for this not happening was something that the coalition leadership has said all along. We can't go to elections when we're in the middle of a war. So it is possible that the elections will take place on time, which is going to be somewhere in the fall this year. It is possible, and God knows where we're going to be there, then the election will have to be postponed. But also Netanyahu himself has portrayed himself all his life as Mr. Security. And being in a state of war could strengthen him. We're not seeing it in the polls yet, but versus in comparison to his contenders, has missed their security. And so it serves a dual goal, even though the motivation has not just been political. That's for sure.
Okay. I just want to explore some of the recent reporting about the backdrop to the war and the thinking in the Israeli leadership. I'm sure you know the New York Times was reporting the other day that the Mossad chief went to the prime minister with a plan and said he believed that within days of the war's beginning, his service would likely be able to galvanize the Iranian opposition, igniting riots, other acts of rebellion that could lead to the collapse of the regime imminently. So how did Mossad get it so wrong?
So I have not seen the PowerPoint by the Mossad. I see some reporting now that indicates the Mossad never said this will happen right away, that there's a timeline issue. After strikes are complete, within, I think I saw reporting that between 6 months and a year, the Iranian regime will fall. And by the way, we can think of the counterfactual. We've seen these massive protests in Iran in January, right? And we also knew that Ayatollah Ali Khamenei was going to be 87 years old soon. So there is a hypothetical scenario that even without the strikes, this regime would fall in a year. We can never test this. But this is sort of in the defense of the Mossad. There's a timeline issue that was not reported. In that regard, this leak, whether it came from the US or it came from the IDF, there's a lot of competition in terms of the IDF and Mossad here and the politicians and who wants to throw the Mossad under the bus. But here's where I would have expected some agency, right, on the part of leadership, both Israel and the US, to say, okay, this is one idea and one option, but what if it doesn't work? And you can't base decisions on hypothetical operational plan to topple a regime. My fear is that these reports, and I'm sure they're based on truth, and New York Times does most serious reporting, they would only, I'll try to be diplomatic. There are a lot of people around the world that blame Israel for dragging the US into this war. And these reports only strengthen this narrative, which I think for Israel is very, very dangerous.
Dangerous because of American public opinion?
Because of American public opinion, first and foremost, American legislators, obviously. And I'm mind to say that whereas the Israeli public and the Israeli government, Prime Minister Netanyahu sees the international communities between Pennsylvania Avenue and Capitol Hill, it also matters what public opinion is in other countries. Israel is part of, or it's not part of Europe, but it has the most important trade relationships with Europe, most investment, open skies, flights, cultural initiatives. The Israeli academia and R&D cannot survive without European funding. I mean, it matters what the world thinks, and relationships matter. And I haven't even begun speaking about, the neighborhood, the Middle East.
I mean, it's already clear that Israel has become more divisive within the Republican Party and the MAGA movement, as well as within the Democratic Party. And also there's polling suggesting that more Americans today are sympathetic towards the Palestinians than the Israelis. I want to ask how closely connected to that you are, like what you really feel when you see numbers like that, Shira, because you were born in New York. You moved to Israel with your parents. You are a citizen of both countries.
Yes, it's very... I have no issues with having greater sympathy for the Palestinians, right? And I don't think it needs to be a zero-sum game, but I will speak of the decline of the favorite views of Israelis around the world. I think it's very dangerous strategically because, first of all, for Israel, the pillar of defense of national security is the special relationship with the United States. And I'm not sure this relationship can be sustained, definitely not with these trends that we're seeing at the moment. On the personal level, there's also an issue. The relationship between Israel and the Jewish community has been also a pillar of Israel's strength. And as someone who roams in both of these communities, I often find that the Jewish community is awfully concerned in the US on both sides, Republicans and Democrats. Most of the Jews in the United States are Democrats, but on both sides, there's a real concern for Israelis. I don't think that Israelis are fully sympathetic to American Jews and diaspora Jews in the same way, and not understanding how difficult it has been also for American Jews. And I'm speaking mostly American Jews, not just elsewhere, because this is the community I know the most, how hard it's been for them over the past 2.5 years, starting after October 7, obviously, with protest campuses, but not only that, rising anti-Semitism and being sort of associated with the country that might have dragged the U.S. into war. I don't buy this narrative, but it's definitely a narrative that is there. And Israel does not understand that what it does affects an entire community that is connected to Israel and is important to Israel. So, both on the strategic levels, but also on the personal levels, it's very worrisome.
And here in the UK, where I'm speaking to you from in the last few days, there's been an attack on ambulances belonging to a Jewish charity in London, which has been chilling not only for the Jewish community, but many others watching.
We definitely see the rise of anti-Semitism. And I'm not one that thinks that any criticism of Israeli policy is anti-Semitism. There's a very clear difference. But the numbers speaks for themselves. There's a rising anti-Semitism, and it feeds into a narrative. And in Israel, both the policymakers and the public is, I don't say oblivious to this, but not as sensitive as they need to be, not understanding that it will backfire.
On the relationship with the United States, regardless of who took whom to war, there is something fundamentally different that happened last summer with the 12-day war and now, that the two countries have been part of this war together, one that, as you said, the Israeli Prime Minister has wanted for a long time. But this has been a joint enterprise. What happens, do you think, if that changes? What happens if Donald Trump decides to stop? And if you look at his latest statements, there's very little mention of Israel. He says, we are very willing to do a deal, i.e. the US is willing to do a deal with Iran.
Yes. So very big. I mean, I think there is a difference between the 12-day war and what we're seeing now. Obviously, the 12-day war, the United States, President Trump gave a green light for Israel, and after Israel cleared the sky and did all the work, the United States came with their immense capabilities, performing the mission of Fordo and using capabilities were developed just for this specific mission, and it was game over. And even then, it was very clear that even if this was portrayed as a partnership, Trump, at the end of the day, did tell Israeli planes, which were in the air, to strike Tehran, to turn around. And I have heard from people who were in the command center of the Air Force, where you had the chief of the Israeli Air Force with one phone with the pilots and another phone with the Prime Minister Netanyahu, getting them an order in real time. Come back. So this was an order, straight order from the U.S. president, not from the Israeli prime minister. What we have here is a very different partnership. And you have Israeli Air Force officers, at even senior level and in double-digit numbers, who are stationed in CENTCOM and vice versa, working together. But in terms of the decision-making, it's not a partnership. There's one boss. And this boss is President Trump. But it's very clear, and Israelis across the board, including in the defense establishment, are saying this: when President Trump says we're done, Israel is going to be done. It's not Lebanon or the other fronts. And Israelis could be disappointed at this outcome, because an agreement is not something that Israel favors.
So there's no question in your mind, Israel could not, would not continue if the US calls it a day and doesn't deal with Iran?
I mean, I can't say no chance at all, but I'll put 99.99999% that Israel stops. And I think this is why we're likely to see, not that the tempo has changed, but if you listen to some leaks that came out in the first days of the war, because it was unknown in Israel how long, what's going to be the duration of this, what started as an operation, and I think undeniably is a war, that Israel said we had to strike whatever we can as fast as possible, because this can be stopped in a moment, and we would have to abide by it. Whether Iran stops, it's a different question. Whether there's another round in the future, but I think if there is a declaration of some sort of a ceasefire and agreement, Israel will have to abide by it.
And what then happens to Lebanon? Because that has been this other front, including with ground forces, that has opened up in the last few weeks, including the blowing up of bridges. And now the finance minister, Bezalel Smotrich, saying that the Litani River in southern Lebanon should be a new border between Israel and Lebanon.
Yes.
Now, if that happens, that's essentially a new occupation.
Right, exactly. It's probably not likely, but I would have hoped that whatever agreement, if there is one with Iran, it is a broader agreement that also includes Hezbollah. I'm not sure the U.S. attention is there at the moment, and I'm not sure Israel is pushing for it. But absent this, what is now a very secondary front, Lebanon, could turn into the primary front, with Israel just digging deeper. We're seeing targeted strikes, but we're also seeing the IDF taking more and more positions inside Lebanon and creating de facto a buffer zone. It is not an occupation at the moment, but it could turn into one absent a diplomatic agreement. And, you know, Israel has a long history of occupying land in Lebanon, and it never delivered the result that Israelis want. So I'm very concerned about this folly, and I do hope that the international community, and it needs to be led by the United States, sees this idea of capitalizing on military achievements in Iran and the fact that the Iranians are going to be busy and maybe unable to fund their proxies at the same level, and taking advantages of really remarkable historical trends in Lebanon, anti-Hezbollah sentiment, and I don't want to say welcoming of Israel, but no longer the taboo of imagining even peace with Israel. And there's really an opportunity in Lebanon that we risk squandering now with digging deeper, doing something that, you know, this definition of insanity, doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. This is how I see the Israeli campaign at the moment. And no one questions the fact that the Israeli north, the Galilee, shouldn't be shelled by terrorist organization on the border, and that the Lebanese state should do more to contain it. But Israel has a partner in Lebanon, and if Israel occupies parts of Lebanon, it's going to lose the partner.
The Lebanese government, you mean, who would like to see Hezbollah disarmed and its influence brought to an end?
Yes, definitely. It's the Lebanese government, and we have the Lebanese public, and, you know, the Shiite community, which is the Hezbollah support base. We're seeing also fractures in this support base. People representative of the Shia community, they're saying, well, Hezbollah doesn't represent us. They care more about the interests of Iran than the interests of the Lebanese. And so, you know, this whole idea of disarming terrorist organizations, it can never be a solely military endeavor. It hasn't worked anywhere. And where you are with the IRA, it's never just a kinetic activity. It has to come with the support. There's a political partner that's not less important. And this opportunity for taking on Hezbollah politically is available now in Lebanon. The Lebanese government needs help. They don't need to be squashed from the side.
Are you even saying, Shira, that the policy of disarming terrorist organizations, even as you look at Gaza, that ultimately this strategy on Hamas has not worked and will not work?
As we talk now, and maybe under the fog of war, everyone forgot where Gaza is, but we are 5 months in after signing a ceasefire in Gaza that, thank goodness, brought the Israeli hostages back home and allowed the Palestinians in Gaza some sort of respite of relief. But as we're looking at Gaza, you have Hamas, the de facto sovereign governor of half of Gaza, where most of the people are. Israel occupies the other half. There are so many indications that Hamas is really the governing power with arms on the street. Israel, for 2 years, tried to disarm Hamas kinetically, and it hasn't worked. It has to come with a political part where Palestinians will disarm Palestinians. It has to be something the Palestinian people choose to do. Now, I do hope that after this Iran round finishes, we can focus on Gaza, where there is a framework. We can criticize some elements of it, but the 20-point plan that President Trump delivered, and a national technocratic committee that's supposed to come into Gaza, and Palestinian Authority that is supposed to come back at one point after. But none of these things have advanced. But the opportunity still exists, and we shouldn't miss that either, because otherwise what it means is that Israel will go back to fighting in Gaza as well. And this could happen in the next few months.
And would that be with, again, the blessing of the Americans? Because there's this little recognized internationally body, the Civil Military Cooperation Center, which is essentially part of the US Army. And that is in southern Israel. I think you know about that organization. It's supposed to be monitoring the ceasefire and keeping an eye on what's happening on the ground in Gaza.
Yeah, I'm a frequent visitor to the CMCC, and I think it has a lot of advantages, monitoring the ceasefire and coordinating aid or goods that go into Gaza. I don't know if the U.S. is going to bless renewed fighting. I do think, and maybe I hope, that President Trump sees this as an achievement of his foreign policy, the pursuit of peace, bringing this ceasefire and creating the structures. And I have a lot of appreciation for the Trump administration. I had not thought that they would lead a UN Security Council resolution, that they would be speaking about negotiations and Palestinian state, right? And I think because of pressure from the international community, they did go to these modalities and brought them into their framework. I'm putting aside the other criticisms of issues. It all hinges now on Hamas willing to accept a gradual disarmament framework and following through, and then Israel agreeing to do what it takes. My assessment is that neither side, not Israel, not Hamas, not the Palestinian Authority, not the UN, no one wants to be blamed for derailing this effort because it is important to President Trump. I am not sure that any of these parties really want this to succeed. And for this to succeed, you need really to make an utmost effort. And that's why the US push is very much needed, because, again, there is a ceasefire, but the fire hasn't really ceased.
But, I mean, Shira, this death toll of 70,000 people, Palestinians, not including those who might be buried under the rubble still, including 18,000 children. It is, and at the same time, to see what is ongoing in the West Bank. And that's not only Israeli settlers, that's also the actions of the Israeli military. And just one example was the shooting of a couple and 2 children in their car the other day. It's an ongoing picture that, despite the fact that journalists don't have access to many of these scenes, it is seen, and the images and the accounts do travel.
It is so tragic what is happening between Israelis and Palestinians. And when we talk about existential threats, I think this is the existential threat for Israel, right? When Israel is supposed to be a Jewish democracy. And we have this going on in areas that Israel controls security-wise. I'm going to separate the two for a moment. The Gaza death toll is something that is still being debated, not in terms of the numbers, but in terms of the breakdowns of how many of these have been militants. But there's no question, I think this is something that Israelis have become known to see the suffering on the other side. Children are children are children. It does not matter if they're the children of terrorists, right? They are not, it's not their fault. There is the killing, and I don't believe the IDF was engaged on purpose in discriminatory killing. That, I know it doesn't sound right, but there are protocols here in terms of opening fire. But the fact is that 2 years fighting in an urban warfare and being more risk averse about maybe soldiers' lives than Palestinian lives gets you this outcome. Where I saw what I think, and I wrote something about it, some Israelis were upset when I wrote it, but just this idea of not being numb to the suffering of people when it's talking about humanitarian aid, making sure that people have shelter, making sure that people have food. And this was also something that we saw in this war. And it's very, I mean, when you talk about, the Jewish American in me, right, it's against Jewish values. And not seeing this. And yes, of course, there were Israeli hostages in Gaza. And of course, they were treated we can't even imagine the suffering that they've been through. And there was no empathy and no sympathy among the Israelis for Palestinians after what had happened October 7, the rape, miming, and everything that happened. But this is where, nothing justified October 7, but October 7, in my view, couldn't justify everything. And this is where we were in Gaza. The West Bank is almost like a separate territory, even though it is Palestinian. Bezalel Smotrich, who you mentioned when it comes to Lebanon, is arguably, and don't hate me for saying this, is arguably the number one strategist in Israel at the moment. Because he, and I'll give him credit for it, says what he means. He writes it black on white in Hebrew and in English, speaks in the same language. And he, in 2017, had a manifesto where he says that Israel will annex all the West Bank and will transfer the Palestinian population. And if they are not happy with the conditions they're offered, they're willing to fight. And basically, under the fog of war, he's been implementing his vision in the West Bank. And what we have is de facto annexation of territory, making Palestinians' lives miserable. And it's not maybe a government, I don't want to say government sponsored, but it's unchecked behavior of, I'm saying settler violence because the violence is occurring in the West Bank, but a complete disregard for Palestinian lives and livelihood.
You interviewed Mr. Smotrich, didn't you, a few years ago when he was starting to talk about this plan? Did you, as you sat with him at that time, did you think this is a fantasy, or did you think he's going to make this happen?
Well, we spoke on the phone. He was the Minister of Transportation then. I thought it was a fantasy. I didn't do a report comparing different visions for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, including like a one-state solution. I think around the world, when people talk about one-state solution, they imagine the kumbaya, equal state, equal rights for all. And it was very clear back then that a more likely one state is the Smotrich vision, one state. But I had never imagined in my life that Bezalel Smotrich, who was interrogated by the Shin Bet for his past and involvement in violent activities, would ever be the finance minister of this country, and with a portfolio of minister in the defense ministry that gives him the control of the bureaucracy. And so much of it is, you probably know, Brits, so much of it is bureaucracy, the control of the bureaucracy of Israel's control of the West Bank, which he's able to do both through specific budgets and also different structures. So no, I couldn't imagine.
Could he be prime minister?
I don't think so. All, again, to the extent that polls are indicative of the outcomes, he may not pass the electoral thresholds. So his party may be out of the government in the next elections when we have elections, which is why he's rushing to implement his vision, because he's not sure he's going to have another turn. I don't think we are not going to see him again. And he might join forces with others. There are all these shenanigans here to get people back in the Knesset, in the Israeli parliament. But I don't think he could be prime minister. But who knows?
But haven't some of his positions become more mainstream in Israel? Like whatever happens to his own political future, hasn't Israeli public as a whole been moved more to the right, not only since October the 7th, but before that?
I think you're exactly right. We are seeing a shift to the right. It's not that Israelis were on the verge of a two-state solution on October 6, 2023, and October 7th shattered the picture. We can trace maybe Israeli shift to the second Intifada, which came after a peace process. Israelis felt that Ehud Barak, back then Prime Minister, genuinely gave a peace proposal to back then Arafat, and with buses exploding in the middle of the cities that sort of turned the Israelis and thinking there is no partner on the other side. Netanyahu definitely fed on the no partner. And for a long time, until October 7, Israelis didn't even remember there were Palestinians around. Think about it. Gaza is behind a wall. We saw it's a more fickle wall than we had assumed, but Gaza was behind a wall. Most Israelis don't live in the West Bank. They don't visit the West Bank. Who even gets close to the West Bank? So you live your life normally. You pretend you're part of Europe. Go to the US often. There's a booming tech sector, and didn't even remember the Palestinians to think about taking a risk. Why? When there was no imminent threat. And then when the ultimate threat came, right, in October 7th, sort of showed in the most monstrous way that there are actors on the other side. And Hamas is not the Palestinian Authority. Hamas is a terrorist organization. Not all Palestinians want to kill Israelis, but in the Israeli mindset that fed into a narrative that there are no innocent people in Gaza, apropos what we mentioned before. This is not sentence you hear from Israelis. And if we pull away from the West Bank, the same thing that happened from Gaza will happen. And that's closer to Tel Aviv and closer to the airport and closer to Jerusalem. And God forbid we could do this. We can never have them independent and we can never withdraw. And this is something that sank in. And I do hope it will take some time for the Israelis to think there's another way. But I do hope there will also be leadership that presents this alternative vision, because one of the tragedies is it's not just Netanyahu, also from the opposition leaders. You don't hear of a vision of separating peacefully from the Palestinians, understanding that there's a partner on the other side, not an ideal partner, but there's a partner on the other side. The vast majority of Palestinians do not want to wake up in the morning and kill Jews, right? Israelis don't hear that, and they should hear this from leadership. It shouldn't come from the public to tell the leadership what to do. That's not how leadership is supposed to work.
But it would be a brave leader, wouldn't it, who stood up and said, Palestinians have rights too, just as Israel has a right to exist, Palestine should have a right to exist.
It's a very brave Israeli position to take today, and I don't think anyone will take it. The tragedy, I think, of both Israelis and Palestinians is that it's portrayed as a zero-sum game, and it's not, right? Your right to self-determination does not negate the others. And it's a small piece of land, but frankly, there's some polling on this. Most Israelis, and definitely most Palestinians, but most Israelis don't care about one hilltop somewhere where they don't even know where it is, closer to the border with Jordan. They only want to wake up in the morning and feel safe. And Palestinians want to feel safe too. And, it's easier for me to speak about the lack of Israeli leadership that presents this vision, but we haven't had a good vision on the Palestinian side either, right? A Palestinian leader that comes and tells their people, we live with the Israelis. Most of the Israelis don't want to kill us. We accept there was war, and we're probably not going to return to our homes in Haifa and in Tel Aviv, but we will have a state and we will coexist and claim responsibility and offer a vision that, frankly, before speaking to the Israelis, dignifies the Palestinians with efficient services that they deserve. They deserve better leadership too.
To close, Shira, can I ask you to think ahead to 2028? It'll be the year of Israel's 80th birthday. It will also be, by the end of the year, a time with a new president coming into the White House in the United States. What do you think Israel will look like by then? What do you think Israel-US relations will look like by then?
I do want to be optimistic, because I can't stress how important the next Israeli elections are. And we only, in our group of friends, the very few who are still in Israel, because so many of them have left the country in the past few years, as a direct result of the policies of the Israeli government. But so many of the others that have left are holding their passports in hand and not making decisions about changing house and stuff, just waiting for the outcomes of this election. If there's a different government in Israel, maybe not the ideal government, but a different government that sees the benefits of the country, all of the country, not just the settler and the Haredi population, right, the sectors that they support, and sees as a priority to, first of all, I'm not saying that we're not going to, I doubt we're going to see a Palestinian state, but there's going to be a complete stop to settler violence and complete halt to the damaging trends, and leadership that improves relationship with Israel's neighbors, and that sees the Jewish community and sees the need to improve relationship with Europe, which is really a big priority issue also for Israel. I think Israeli-U.S. ties can sustain this also, and we're going to see a shift. We're not past the Rubicon in a sense that I think it's a lost cause. However, if the elections bring us a coalition government that is sort of what we're saying today, which is unlikely, and all polling shows that this coalition is not going to come to being again. It's going to be very, very difficult to convince the world that there needs to be a separation between the Israeli government and the Israeli public.
Shira Efron, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mishal. Thank you for having me.